A blacksmith's orphan daughter is mocked for her soot-blackened hands in the town square, while the man who will end the mocker's fortune watches quietly from the shadow of the livery stable. The wind off the high plains carried the smell of coal smoke and horse sweat through Dry Creek, Wyoming Territory. It was the autumn of 1887, and the town square was crowded for market day. Ruth Calloway knelt by the water trough, scrubbing at her hands. No matter how hard she scrubbed, the black soot from her father's forge lived under her fingernails, ground into the creases of her knuckles. She was 11 years old, and she had long ago stopped expecting her hands to ever look clean. Her father, Samuel Calloway, was the only blacksmith in 3 counties. He'd built his forge with his own hands the year Ruth was born, and he'd kept it running alone since her mother died of the fever 2 winters back. Ruth spent her afternoons at his side, pumping the bellows, sorting nails, learning the trade because there was no one else to help him. She wore a patched brown apron over a dress that had been let out twice and taken up once. The hem was uneven. A square of gray canvas, cut from a feed sack, covered a tear near the knee. She did not think much of it, until Mrs. Bettina Vance decided to. "Well, would you look at that?" Mrs. Vance said, loud enough to turn heads across the square. She was the wife of Elmer Vance, president of the Dry Creek Trust Bank, and she wore a violet traveling coat trimmed in rabbit fur. 2 other merchants' wives stood beside her, parasols tilted against the sun. "Ruth Calloway, is it?" Mrs. Vance continued, stepping closer, her nose wrinkling. "Goodness. Have you been rolling in a coal bin, child?" The women beside her laughed, sharp, practiced laughter, the kind meant to be heard. Ruth's hands, still wet from the trough, curled instinctively behind her back. "It's from the forge, ma'am," she said quietly. "I help my father." "Of course you do." Mrs. Vance's eyes swept down to the patched knee of Ruth's dress, then to her scuffed boots, one sole beginning to separate at the toe. "A girl ought to look like a girl, not a chimney sweep. Honestly, Samuel Calloway ought to be ashamed, letting his daughter run about looking like she does. But then, I suppose a man behind on his mortgage can't afford much shame, can he?" The other women tittered. One of them covered her mouth with a gloved hand. Across the square, at the counter of the forge, Samuel Calloway's hammer stopped mid-swing. He had heard every word. His jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened around the handle of the hammer, but he said nothing. He could not afford to say anything. The Dry Creek Trust Bank held the note on his forge, and Elmer Vance had made it plain more than once that men who caused him trouble found their loans called in early. Ruth stared at the ground, at her own reflection warped in a puddle by the trough, smudged face, patched dress, cracked boots. She wished, not for the first time, that the ground would simply open and take her. "Come along, Ruth," her father called, his voice carefully even. "We've work to finish." Ruth hurried toward him, keeping her eyes down, the women's laughter still ringing in her ears. Neither of them noticed the tall stranger standing at the mouth of the livery stable across the square. He wore a long trail coat gray with dust, and a hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. He had arrived in Dry Creek only that morning, leading 2 pack mules, and had said barely a dozen words to anyone. He had heard everything too. His name was Elias Merrow. And within the week, Elmer Vance would learn exactly whose money truly ran Dry Creek, and it was not his own. By the 2nd week, Elias Merrow had not left Dry Creek. He kept a room above the saloon and spent his days quietly, walking the rail survey lines east of town, speaking with freight haulers, asking careful questions that seemed to lead nowhere in particular. Most of the town assumed he was simply a cattle buyer waiting on a herd. Few people noticed how closely he watched the bank. What no one in Dry Creek knew, not Samuel, not Ruth, not even Elmer Vance himself, was that Elias Merrow owned the Merrow Mining Consortium, the single largest freight account on the books of the Dry Creek Trust Bank. Every loan Vance had extended to cover the bank's own debts, every note he'd used to keep the institution afloat through a lean summer, traced back through 3 shell arrangements to Elias's own ledgers. Vance had been borrowing against a man he had never met. Elias had built his fortune the way he did everything, quietly and without needing anyone to know his name. He had come to Dry Creek not for cattle, but because his surveyors had flagged something troubling in the paperwork for the coming rail spur. A pattern of small foreclosures timed suspiciously close to the announcement of the new rail route. Tradesmen, smiths, millers, men whose land sat directly along the surveyed path. It took Elias 4 days to find the surveyor Vance had bribed, a nervous young man named Foster who broke down within an hour of being confronted, and signed a full confession in exchange for his own name being kept out of the newspapers. It took 2 more days to find the falsified appraisal Vance had filed on Samuel Calloway's forge, valuing it at a fraction of its worth, just enough to justify calling the loan and seizing the property before the rail spur made that same land priceless. Vance's plan was simple and cruel. Foreclose quietly. Buy the land back through a third party at a pittance. Resell it to the incoming railroad, which Vance believed to be controlled by distant investors in Cheyenne, at 10 times the price. He did not know he was planning to sell the land back to the very man whose money he'd been borrowing all along. On a gray Thursday morning, Samuel Calloway received a letter from the bank. His loan was being called. He had 30 days to pay the balance in full or the forge, his father's anvil, his mother's kettle still hanging by the hearth, the only home Ruth had ever known, would be seized. Samuel did not tell Ruth that night. He sat by the cold forge long after she'd gone to bed, turning the letter over in his hands, trying to imagine a version of the next month that didn't end in ruin. He did not know that across town Elias Merrow was doing arithmetic of his own, laying Foster's signed confession, the falsified appraisal, and a set of his own bank records side by side on a hotel room desk, building a case that would not just save one blacksmith's forge, but end Elmer Vance's career by sundown. The next morning, Elias walked into the Dry Creek Trust Bank. He wore the same dusty trail coat he'd arrived in. Behind him came 4 of his own men from the consortium office, unarmed, quiet, watchful. Word spread through the square faster than he walked. By the time Elias reached the bank's heavy oak doors, a small crowd of townspeople had begun to gather outside, drawn by nothing more than the current running through the street. Inside, Elmer Vance sat behind his mahogany desk, adjusting his spectacles, entirely unaware that the stranger walking toward him controlled every dollar he'd ever borrowed, and was about to prove it in front of the whole town. Elmer Vance looked up as the bank doors swung open, and his practiced smile faltered for just a moment when he saw the crowd gathering behind the stranger in the dusty trail coat. "Mr. Merrow," Vance said, rising halfway from his chair. "I wasn't expecting." "I imagine not," Elias said. His voice was calm, unhurried. He crossed the lobby and set a folded paper on the desk. "Foster's confession. He's quite specific about the appraisal you asked him to falsify on the Calloway property." Vance's face drained of color. "That man will say anything for money. This proves nothing." "It proves enough." Elias placed a second document beside the first, a ledger page, the ink still crisp. "This is the loan record for the Merrow Mining Consortium account. The account this bank has been borrowing against for the better part of a year, Mr. Vance, to keep its own doors open. That account belongs to investors out of Cheyenne," Vance said, though his voice had thinned. "It belongs to me." Elias let the words settle in the silent room. "You spent a year planning to buy foreclosed land cheap and sell it to my railroad at a premium. You were trying to sell my own investment back to me, Mr. Vance, using money you already owed me." A murmur moved through the crowd now pressed into the lobby doorway. Samuel Calloway stood near the back, having followed the commotion from his forge, hammer still in hand, soot still on his knuckles. Beside him, small and quiet, stood Ruth. Vance looked around the room for a friendly face and found none. Even the bank's own teller had stepped back from the counter. "I'm withdrawing the consortium's accounts from this institution, effective immediately," Elias continued. "Every dollar. You have until sundown to resign your position, Mr. Vance, or I'll see to it the territorial bank examiners have Foster's confession by morning." Vance said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Elias turned from the desk and walked to where Samuel and Ruth stood at the edge of the crowd. He reached into his coat and produced a single sheet of paper, the loan note for the Calloway forge, and tore it cleanly in half. "Your account is settled, Mr. Calloway," Elias said. "And the consortium will need a blacksmith for the rail spur, horseshoes, tools, fittings, steady work for years. If you're willing." Samuel could barely find his voice. "Mr. Merrow, I don't know how to." "Say yes," Elias said, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "Yes," Samuel said. "Yes, of course." Near the doorway, Mrs. Bettina Vance had pushed her way into the lobby just in time to hear it all. Her husband ruined, their fortune undone in the space of a single conversation. Her violet coat suddenly looked garish under the weight of what she now understood. Her eyes dropped, almost against her will, to Ruth, standing tall despite her patched dress and soot-marked hands. Ruth did not gloat. She remembered what her father always told her, that a strong spine didn't need to shout. She simply met Mrs. Vance's eyes, gave a small, polite nod, and turned to walk out into the cold autumn light beside her father. By the following spring, the rail spur reached Dry Creek, and Samuel Calloway's forge worked from dawn until dusk, busier than it had ever been. Elmer and Bettina Vance left town before the first frost, and no one in Dry Creek missed them. Elias Marrow stayed on longer than anyone expected, and visited the Callaway Forge often, sitting on an overturned crate while Ruth swept iron shavings and asked him questions about railroads and faraway cities. He never spoke of the bank. He never needed to. Years later, when Ruth Callaway packed her trunk for a teaching college in Denver, she took very little with her: her mother's kettle, a photograph of her father at the forge, and, folded at the bottom of the trunk, a small blackened scrap of her old patched apron. She kept it to remember where quiet strength had once stood beside her, unasked, and refused to let cruelty go unanswered.